afternoon and welcome to Let's Talk About It, All the Things. Hi, Whitney.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good.
We took a week off.
We did take a week off. I hope that everyone out there noticed that we took a week off.
I'm sure they did.
I'm sure that they did. They missed us.
Yes.
Whitney and I took a week off. We did not have a guest, and quite honestly, both of us were going through some things, and just our energy was not up for it.
It was not.
So we mutually decided that we were going to take
We took our mental break.
We did. So we're just going to call that our mental health timeout, I guess.
Yeah, I like
for
that.
us. Yeah. So we're back. And we're super excited
Yes.
because we have a guest today. And this is a conversation I am super, super excited about. So let's just jump into it.
Yes. Let's do this.
I'm going to welcome Alyssa.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Alyssa, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, your specialties, and kind of give our audience an overview, I guess?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Alyssa. I'm a therapist. I used to work in Birmingham, but we just relocated last week to Huntington Woods. So I own a small group practice, and each of our therapists specialize in a different area of expertise for diagnosis. So for me, mine are mainly trauma and eating disorders. And so I got into this work when I was in grad school at U of M. They placed me in an eating disorders program, and that's where I kind of got to get some of the clinical experience. And then doing the work, I was like, oh, this is actually pretty interesting. It wasn't what I saw myself doing, and I fell in love with it. And now that's like the main population that I see. So it's a lot of teenagers that I see, young adults, and then some adults too that are, 40s and 50s. So it's quite the range of ages there.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
very
pretty cool.
fun. Yeah, love it.
What were you originally thinking about going into?
So I originally, when I was in school, I loved inpatient psychiatry. Like I loved the crisis, talking about self-harm and really dark depressive states. That was really rewarding work for me. And so I did that when I was in school for my bachelor's degree. I worked there as a mental health technician and I loved it. And then I worked at U of M's inpatient unit after I graduated and really enjoyed that work too. But then I was, thinking I really am somebody who's really relational. So I want to see people for longer than that short period of time. So it was a good experience for a few years. And then I got back into the eating disorder world and I really liked it.
Nice.
Excellent. So I'm sure you can all guess that our topic today is eating disorders. So eating disorders and body dysmorphia and kind of all the things, because we know that our youth especially are really struggling with that. I've just in the past couple of years, I've met a handful of teenagers through a mentor program that I'm a part of who are struggling very much with an eating disorder. Two of them came straight out of COVID, and just that was kind of the start of their eating disorder.
And can we define the eating disorder? Because I think when most people hear eating disorder, they immediately think anorexia, they don't want to eat all that. And yet, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not just that. It's actually overeating. It's stress eating.
Yeah. There's such a range in so many different types of eating disorders that people aren't familiar with. There's ones that have to do, a lot of eating disorders, I will say, are based in restriction. Even, when you think about binge eating disorder, a lot of that is rooted in mental restriction from foods and different things like that. But there's even eating disorders that aren't related to weight, shape, and size like we traditionally see. They're more related to textures of food, or a lot of times parents will say, I have a really picky eater, that they are only eating certain vegetables or certain foods. So there's such a spectrum of eating disorders. But yeah, it's hard to define. I was thinking that on the way here. I was like, how would I even define an eating disorder? Because I think the traditional definition says disordered eating. It's well, that's not super helpful. Yeah. But I think it's really having a relationship with food in your body that is the way I like to describe it is it's off balance. There's some sort of emotional component to it that food feels like it's very moral, or there's a lot of guilt or shame around food or exercise, things like that. So I know it's not a super great definition, but it's kind of a spectrum of different things, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, Whitney, because I also was thinking it was like bulimia, anorexia, but that's very interesting that you bring up even just like kids who are fussy eaters and like textures and stuff. I never really thought about that.
Yeah, I never thought it like that. I just always thought of, anorexia or stress eating, so you're underweight or overweight in a
Yeah.
sense, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that which we can probably talk about a little bit later too, but the impacts of malnutrition in any sense, whether it's undereating, overeating, RFID is what they call like kind of the more picky eating type behaviors. They all have the same impacts on the body, so it is like still in the same realm, but we don't talk about it very much. We only kind of have this picture of like it's a thin, usually white female that comes from like a privileged home or something like that, but it's not the case. It looks very different. It's very interesting.
Very, very cool. So where do you want to start, Alyssa?
Oh my goodness. Loaded question. Oh gosh. Well,
Because there's so many different ways,
Yeah.
like avenues we could go with this. So
Yeah.
I kind of want to just, what do you think is most important to talk about today?
well, I guess you mentioned the pandemic kind of to start, and I think that was a really interesting point in doing private practice or outpatient work, a lot of people know it as, was after the pandemic, eating disorders skyrocketed, specifically with teens, but young adults too. And, COVID had a big impact on so many different things. We saw mental health awareness kind of go up because of the depressive episodes. We were all isolated and anxious and all these different things. But eating disorders, it was really interesting with teenagers because, when we see a lot of kids a lot of the times, right, are implementing a new movement routine or they're focusing on cooking or different things. When we're in isolation, we're like, cool, you go girl. Like you're, doing different things to keep yourself occupied. But the things that most adults that we weren't seeing was kind of the flip side of that social pressure that was coming from social media, which I know makes me sound like very like old and millennial, like those TikTokers, but like it was like all over TikTok. It was like this pressure of like, okay, you have to use this time to be productive. You have to be skinny. You have to lose the weight. You have to be doing all these things. And so coupling that with already the diet culture we live in kind of, I think, really bogged down this big population of kids that kind of flew under the radar for a long time. So with eating disorders, if you don't catch them, the longer that they go on, right, it's more difficult to treat, as with most illnesses. But with eating disorders specifically, they can just rapidly worsen, and a lot of parents don't know how to communicate about healthy relationships with food and bodies because we're not taught that either. So it's very easy for them to spiral. And so that was like a really interesting kind of thing that we saw in the pandemic. And so it's been a lot more talk about eating disorders, I think, recently, which has been really cool. But yeah, it just made me think of that point. I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but it just made me think of how it spiraled, initially. So
Yeah. So you see primarily, you said young adults, so teenagers, young adults.
Yep.
I'm going to assume, not that that's across the board, but mostly females probably.
Yep.
And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that because, on Dragonfly's Wings, we're all about youth mental health. And I know that eating disorders and body dysmorphia and all of that is a really big topic right now, about just them not feeling like they're enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not thin enough. I'm not this. I'm not that. So maybe can we talk about like how a parent could identify, because I'm sure that your teen is not going to be telling you, oh, hey, I think I have an eating disorder.
Right.
So how would a parent, like, what are there signs? Like, how would they identify that their teen has a potential eating disorder? And then kind of what steps do they take to help them?
Yeah, it can be a handful of different things. And so sometimes they're more subtle signs. A lot of times I say like there's kind of like the behavioral pieces that you can look out for and then more of the emotional side of things. But a lot of parents that I meet with say that they initially kind of noticed, of course, weight loss is like a big one that, usually initiates a trip to a pediatrician or to a dietitian or something like that. And that's kind of where things start to unravel. But it can also be, a handful of different things. A lot of times kids will say, teenagers will say, I don't really feel like eating that. That hurts my stomach a little bit. Or, it's like a food that they love. If they've loved pasta their whole life and they're like, I think I might have a gluten allergy. And you're like, well, wait a minute. You just had pasta, a few months ago and you really loved it. Those are some of the more subtle ones that fly under the radars, like restricting foods or food groups, or this sudden like obsession with like clean eating, or I'm changing my diet, I'm improving, I'm doing these different things.
Real quick, what about if, say, if they're in school, since it's more of a teenage realm, what if they say, oh, it's too busy with schoolwork?
That is a really, really big one too. Like I don't have time to eat at school, which like is totally fair. I mean, high school students, like they have like such a small amount of time, if you think about it, to eat food. But that's like a big part of like what we do in treatment is like really carving out time for adults and teenagers to make sure that you're setting aside time to nourish. Otherwise, we don't function at our optimal state. But that's a huge one too. I didn't have time to eat. Or a lot of times parents will notice if they have packed lunch, they come home, there's still a lot of the components remaining, and they just said, no, I just wasn't hungry, or I was busy. That can be big ones. Eating disorders in general are very isolative illnesses. So a lot of times people will notice their kids are withdrawing a lot more socially. They're not spending time with friends, more body conscious, making comments kind of about their appearance, or spending more time in front of mirrors, things like that, or wearing clothes that are a little bit more baggy, not as form-fitting. But I would say the number one thing I always say is just, like parents, you know your kids. And so if you're noticing something feels a little off, like it probably is true, So those are the big ones that I see with teenagers. But sometimes they surprise us, and sometimes they come to us and say, oh, actually, this feels a little icky. And then, that's great when that happens. But a lot of times, like you said, it's, more difficult for them to communicate that with us.
Yeah. I mean, how many kids do you see that really don't realize that's what they have?
A lot. There's some kids that surprise you with like their amount of insight and connection to themselves when they get talking. You're like, wow, you're really insightful for a 16-year-old. But then a lot of them come in and they're like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why I'm talking to you. Like, my parents think this is a problem. It's not a problem. I don't know what the problem is with losing weight. I've been, around people who are in like wrestling, for example, right? Like that's such a normalized culture for us. Like they drop weight all the time. They can manipulate their weights and nobody gets on them for eating. Why is it with me? And so a big part of like the hurdle is to be like, well, no, this actually probably doesn't feel the same, even though go down a whole rabbit hole of why the wrestling approach or something like that can be harmful. But it's like tapping into like, okay, but what feels different or what feels not so great about this situation? But so many kids and so many adults don't really, think that that's what's happening. They're like, I'm stressed, or, I'm having like an intolerance to a food or something. It never used to make me anxious. And then when you dive deeper, you're like, oh yeah, actually this is maybe a little bit deeper rooted than what we originally thought.
So you brought up athletics, and that's really interesting to me too, because I remember my oldest son, when he was a freshman in high school and he was on the football team for the high school, and they had like a minimum calorie intake that they had to do. And it was excessive. It was ridiculous. I mean, I don't know. I don't even remember the number. I'm going to throw out, it was definitely over 5,000 calories.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, he's eating like 500 meals a day is what it seemed like, and not always all that great of stuff, because he's just trying to just bulk, he was on defense. And so, it's the bigger you are, right?
Yeah.
So, and I never really thought of that until you said the wrestling. I mean, so I'm wondering, athletics and kind of as coaches, when we're talking to kids about eating, I don't even know the question I'm trying to ask here.
I know where you're trying to go with this. Yeah, it's like, how can the school athletic directors make it healthy enough for the kids to do that process for whatever they're wrestling, football, baseball, whatever they're doing? How can they make that healthy without affecting their mental state?
Right. Like, how do we have the balance of putting an emphasis on food because that's what you need from a physical standpoint, while not feeling like we're tapping too much into the control realm of being really rigid with food too? Yeah. It's so tricky. And I think like a big thing that that I use in my practice and a lot of dietitians will use too is we talk about food as energy, which I, have I could say an argument both ways of how that can be helpful and unhelpful because we're supposed to enjoy food too. There's food for pleasure is really, really important culturally and, so many different ways. But a lot of times when we're reframing some of these thoughts, we think of food as energy. So if, a football player or a wrestler or whatever, you think that they have kind of this standard, they have this amount of intake per day. If they're, doing a really intensive practice or a game or something like that, that's extra fuel that they're going to need. And so sometimes making that balance of you're just replenishing the energy that you're going to be using, because that's all calories are, it's just units of energy. But, we think of them in a very different way, but thinking of it as the sense of, we need to have so much energy to sustain you for this 4-hour practice or this, game, and not so much focusing on the numbers of it or, the fact that we need to be eating clean or we need these certain things. I think more of zooming out a little bit, if that kind of answers what you were saying. I think of a way to kind of do the healthy balance of getting both aspects in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. I like that idea of kind of taking a zoom out, like you said,
Right.
and looking at it more.
Well, look at gymnastics.
Yeah.
Probably one of the worst, I'm assuming,
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
in all athletics to lose weight.
Yeah. And dance.
Yeah.
Dance, which is silly because I thought that I would have thought of that prior, but when I was 2 years in the private practice and I was thinking about it and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I'm seeing all these influx of dancing kids. Of course this makes sense, but I never even considered it before. But how much body image is just emphasized of gotta look good in a certain outfit and you're in front of mirrors all day, and eating disorders are very competitive illnesses anyways. And so when you're standing next to a lineup of girls or boys that are in dance too, right, you're constantly comparing, what do I look like next to this person, and how activating that can be for somebody who's really struggling, with that. But I didn't even think about that either when I was first getting into this. I was like, whoa, crazy.
Yeah. So with eating disorders, we talked a little bit about there's a lot of emotions tied in with food. And I've heard the word, food restriction, something I can control, right? So I can control what I do or don't do with food. And sometimes that's a teenager's way of just controlling their environment around them. Am I saying that correctly? So can you expand upon that a little bit, what that looks like?
Yeah. So a lot of times when we think of eating disorders, that is one of the really popular functions of an eating disorder. And I say function in the sense that all of us, we have different behaviors, right? In different ways that we move through the world, that we learn how to get our needs met. And so whether they're good or bad or neutral, whatever it might be, right? An eating disorder serves a function for somebody. It's filling some need or doing something for an individual. And so one of the big ones can be control, a sense of control, because you think about teenagers and autonomy and things like that, right? They have a little bit of that, but they're in that developmental stage where they're starting to figure that out. Who am I? What choices can I make? So when things feel out of control, that's kind of the main thing that they have, right? It's my body, my intake, those are the things I can control. And so that's usually where that can spin back to. And it doesn't even, typically start off as this, I'm going to sign up to have an eating disorder by any means, but, it's okay, if I can, think about ways I can do X, Y, and Z with my diet or movement for that matter. It's just really a slippery slope with that. And it's interesting, when you do the work or when you're in an eating disorder, a lot of times when you're when I'm talking with a client, they'll say a lot of times everything feels so out of control. Now that my parents are trying to, increase my intake and I, feel like I'm eating all the time. And it's once they come out and they're in recovery, they're like, yeah, that wasn't control. That was actually completely out of control. And it's it's funny how that flip-flops when you're out of it and you're not in that headspace, but you feel so in control. But reality, everything around you is out of control with food because you feel so icky all the time. Yeah, it's wild.
I want to shift a little bit and go into stress eating and kind of go into the overeating category. And I'm one to say I've done it too. It's horrible. I'll sit there and stress eat candy. I'm not a sugar person.
Yeah.
And if I'm eating candy, I'm stressed.
Right.
So can we dive into that? Especially, I would like to even say adults, because I think that's more hit on them with work, family, and they're just going, okay, I'm going to eat.
Yep.
But also, you got a TV show, I'm not going to name it just because of issue. I don't want to say it out loud. But I think we all know the TV show.
Right.
There's always a common concept behind the problem, and that was something happened in my past.
Yeah.
So what would you say on that?
Yeah. It's so interesting too, how like, I was just thinking about this the other day too, how like those TV shows are like so normalized. And I remember getting into this work, this is like a side note, and I'll circle back, but I remember getting into this work and I was like, I remember specifically being at the hospital at U of M and I was brand new to eating disorders, like didn't know much. And I remember like kind of casually saying to my supervisor, like named one of the shows, like, do you watch that? Just in casual conversation, not even computing that I'm in an eating disorders program. And she just looked at me and was like, so graciously and like kind and was like, no, I don't watch those. And I was like, oh, okay. And I kind of like just whatever. And then about a year later, like randomly hit me, of course, when you're like in the shower or something or like cooking dinner. And I'm like, I cannot believe I just said that. You're like, well, that's like such a normal part of our culture, but like another way that it's so ingrained that we don't think about it. Right. But with stress eating, kind of emotional eating, it's interesting because it can happen for a handful of different reasons. But kind of what I was saying earlier, sometimes it comes from a place of restriction of, since we live in diet culture all the time, right? There's always this pressure of like being thin, being small, being, in this certain type of body ideal that is priority over our health and our mental health, our physical health, all of those things. And so with that pressure, a lot of times we have this kind of idea in our head of like, I have to constantly be smaller, take up less space. And so that mental piece, you think about it from like a mental restriction kind of standpoint, can cause a lot of kind of just internalized, like fat phobia and, diet culture beliefs, right? And so we, as a consequence to that, just kind of can restrict our food during the day. A lot of times people, if you hear of like cycle diet, dieting, a lot of them turn to be that way. But like, I'm going to be good today. I'm not going to have a snack. I'm not going to have breakfast, or I'm just going to drink a shake or something. And then they get at home and right, they're stressed out from the day. And then all of a sudden, right, like there's all of like this food and it feels like this hunger that cannot be filled. And it's this bottomless thing, right? And then leads to guilt and shame and all those other things. And then the cycle starts again tomorrow. I'm going to be good because I was bad last night. That's a really common kind of approach.
I like the term cheat days.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Cheat days.
Yeah.
Those, yes. Yeah. There's a handful of things, things that sometimes I'm just like, oh, but cheat days is on that list, very high up on there. Yeah. Cause it's like, what are you cheating? What are you exactly cheating from? Who's the rule book here? Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting, like in that sense. And like a lot of times, I'll say for adults specifically, and I do this too, where you get so busy in your day-to-day life that you don't stop to, like, I don't know how many times you guys do this. I do this all the time. I'm like, I got through the whole day and I didn't take a single deep breath. Like, how weird is that? But like, you're constantly going to the next thing. And so a lot of people in the evening, when things quiet down, your brain quiets a little bit, food a lot of times becomes the one thing that they have that they can keep to themselves as like a self-care thing of like, this is my uninterrupted time. People don't have access to me. I don't, I'm not needed for anything. And so typically it's easy to like essentially check out, if that makes sense, and like really just indulge and kind of, go into a binging episode. It's like another common one. And then there's like the common like emotional, emotional suppression, I'll say, or emotional coping of food, because food is comforting. And so a lot of times when people are struggling and they don't have a ton of other emotional regulation skills or distress tolerance, food is an easy one because it's pretty accessible. And so, overeating or, eating to the point where you feel sick is like the big thing. 'Cause I think a lot of us eat to the point where we're overly full, various times, just being human. But eating to the point where we're getting sick, that can tap into some of those, like, oh yes, it's probably disordered if I'm using this as a way to self-soothe or to distract from a problem or an emotion that's really uncomfortable. So it's like a handful of different things with that one.
Okay.
Yeah. And let's talk disordered eating too. I don't know how much of it starts kind of as disordered eating and then leads to an eating disorder, but I just know that, disordered eating is just a problem across all ages, I feel like, right? Like, I mean, I mean, even my mom, I shouldn't eat bread because it's a carb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so I know that, there, and you're right. It's just part of our culture, right?
Yeah.
There's just so many things that are thrown out there, protein
Fast food.
shakes and fast food and intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
And, I have to exercise for, 2 hours a day, or I have to do cardio. But then there's people who say, oh, cardio isn't where it's at. It's, it's weightlifting. And then, so there's just there's all these things thrown at you and you don't know what to believe, what's true.
Yeah.
And,
What's good for your body.
And I feel like we're missing that key component where it's just what makes me actually feel good,
Right.
Going for long walks and trying to eat 80% the food that fuels me, that makes me feel good,
Right.
But can we talk a little bit about that and just culturally, I just feel like it's a mess.
Yeah.
No kidding.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a mess. We can't catch a break with anything. There's nothing we do is right. It's always something.
Yes.
Disordered eating, I think, happens for all of us. And even working in the field, I say things or I do things sometimes I'm even wow, well, that was, pretty disordered, or, and I catch myself, and we're human. That's going to happen. So the best thing we can do is just, notice it and then, move forward with it, with the experience. But we hear that all the time, especially around the holidays, is spooky season for diet culture to come in, because it's you think about the turkey trot and stuff. Everyone eats Thanksgiving dinner and they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna work this off tomorrow, or I've been saving up my calories all day.
Yep.
You're like, okay, Aunt, whoever, just eat your turkey. It's okay. It's not that deep. But we do all kinds of language like that. If you think about saving up our calories for a big meal if you're going somewhere, or exercising a little bit more because you had a food that is considered to be bad or calorie dense or whatever it might be. Fast food, kind of same thing. That's a popular one in terms of feeling guilty about it, or I'm so bad today, I did this, which is interesting because our bodies, when you kind of get down to the nutritional level, our bodies are all breaking down nutrients the same way. So I always joke with the teens I work with of your body doesn't care if it's getting fats from an avocado or a piece of cake. It's going to kind of break down the nutrients the same way, which of course there's some nuance to that, and we want a variety of foods to get our nutrients from. But it's just so ingrained in us that it feels like these are good things, these are bad things, and we talk about it all the time and do it too,
Yeah, it's the morality of food.
Yeah.
I didn't know that food had morals, but it
does.
apparently does.
It does. Yeah. Another big one that's really popular too, that's all over kind of TikTok, or has been the past few months, is the Diet Coke obsession of if I drink a Diet Pop, or I drink a lot of water, right, that fills up my stomach and I'm not going to eat as much later. Or, same things with they used to say all the time, celery, whatever the diet culture comment was it burns more calories to eat celery than it is celery. They used to say that all the time when I was in school, and I was like, what? And it's just weird things like that you're okay, but is it really that deep? Can we just enjoy whatever it is? But it's just integrated everywhere, so many different places. It's wild.
It is.
Yeah, crazy.
And of course, you get all the workout ads, the at-home apps, and macros and this, and find out your balance there, and it's
And
a
all the
disaster.
diet fads, the keto and the Atkins and all those things. And I feel like all of us at some point have done something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Because we felt insecure or not enough for whatever reason, and have done those things. And
Right.
yeah, so any advice on how to make a cultural shift there? I know that's a weighted question, but
No, but it's a good one though. I think the best work that we can do just as a society is to do our own work on our relationship with food and exercise, our body, all of those things, because the way we speak, to others about their food relationship, body relationship, and the way we speak about ourselves is really impactful. With parents, I say all the time, it's almost should be a necessity, right? If your kid's coming in for, relationship with food, it doesn't mean that you have an unhealthy relationship with food as a parent, but we all have diet culture so deeply ingrained that it can't hurt to go to therapy and figure out if there's some internalized beliefs in there, because we all have them inevitably. But I think the biggest thing is working on our own relationship, which was a big part of like my journey. I think leading into therapy, I wanted to kind of do my own work on like, whoa, yeah, this actually was pretty disordered, or like thoughts that I had about, value on a body being a certain size. And that was a lot of prepping to go into private practice. I feel like I wanted to be in a better headspace with that. Was that important? And I mean, some of the other things that can be done from like, I think about school perspectives, like making sure you're having variety to all different types of foods. Health class is always one that like I always feel like comes up in session a lot, of talking about foods in a certain way. So I think like just general education about food. I think a lot of people don't realize like the breaking down of the nutrients or things like that. I didn't know a lot of that until I did my own work too, that it doesn't have to be this black or white system of good or bad with food, and just educating people. And I think that makes a big difference from like I don't know if that would be, I was going to say a top-down approach. I don't know if that's a bottom-up or a top-down approach, but one of the approaches, I think it's good. It meets us in the middle anyways.
Yeah. I mean, I do agree with you 100%. I think that so many of us as adults struggle with just that whole food movement concept, that I do think it is a trickle down to our kids, and that they do pick that up. And watching your mom or your sister or whoever, going through something, like doing keto or whatever it is, I think it plants that in your head, like, oh, well, maybe I should be doing that because
I'll give you a classic one. Sorry, that
Yeah.
just reminded me one. Being a vegetarian or vegan. Say if you chose to be a vegan or a vegetarian somewhere in your life, and then I saw it as your family member, oh, maybe I should try that.
Right.
But maybe it's not for my body.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's so easy because kids internalize things. They're always watching and they're always observing in ways that we don't even realize. Like you'll say something and you'll be like, 7 years from then, you're like, remember this one time you said this on Christmas? You're like, no, I have no idea, but cool. But they're constantly taking in information. And so the more that you speak kindly about your body, right, like helps build them resilience, because inevitably all of our bodies are going to change throughout our lifespan. And so if we can equip kids with the tools to have the resiliency to deal with the stress that happens when our bodies change, because, right, like women happens so many different times, men happen so many different times, but having the skills to be like, okay, I'm okay with this change. It doesn't feel out of control. That's so necessary. But don't think about that, when kids, like you were saying, will sometimes hear moms talk. A lot of times I hear in session, like where they say, oh, I need to go on a diet, or I'm, picking at this area. And if a kid, right, like, of course, loves their mom, is looking, thinking like, oh, I think my mom's perfect the way she is, can question some of that belief of like, do I look like that? Everyone says I look like mommy. Like, what does that mean? And so it's just really subtle things that we don't think about a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So once, a teenager comes to you, like, I know that there's no like set time frame, but like, what is the process of them starting therapy and kind of moving through disordered eating or an eating disorder specifically? Like, what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, usually we do, well, I guess it depends. For certain clients, when they have been in a malnourished state for an extended period of time, the priority is always making sure we get them to a safe space so that they can do the processing that we do in therapy, because a lot of times when their brains are so undernourished, right, like we see like physical things that like outwardly, like they talk slower or their processing is delayed, but a lot of times their memory, right, is like stunted too. And so it's hard to really recall any of the things that we work on in therapy. So sometimes it's taking that approach of, feeling almost, it feels kind of counterproductive at first. You're like trying to challenge food rules by creating new food rules of like, okay, we have to eat this, and this time, and working through logistics. But that's, I would say, like half of the cases, and then other half that it feels like we're in a state where they're working on some of the internalized beliefs and the urges, but they're able to still have nourishment enough to be functioning for therapy appropriately. Then we start to work on, where did we learn this? What does this mean for you if you challenge this thought about food? What does it mean about you as a person? How does that connect your relationships and different things like that? And a lot of times it's, it can be surface level of, yeah, it's diet culture. And of course, like that impacts everybody. And then maybe sometimes the more you get into it, you realize that there's something that really activated this in, younger years, or an event that happened that was really impactful. And then you kind of transition into working into some of that. But it's really cool to see people have freedom from kind of these like thoughts that feel so heavy, after a period of time of processing. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody, be it a teenager or an adult, so if they're in school or either working, that go through their whole day and then finally get home at 7, 8 o'clock at night and go, I didn't eat not one thing. And then by 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, you're binging everything you have for dinner and then going to sleep.
Right.
It's like, I mean, is there any connection to that, or is it just a legit, I was busy and just didn't catch it?
Yeah. Sometimes it is a logistical thing, and it feels like I didn't catch it. But a lot of times I will say with like those clients, like I'm curious about their connection between like mind and body. A lot of times we're taught, to be kind of on autopilot. And so a lot of times we don't notice sensations in our body. Like we can't feel hunger and fullness cues because we're so stressed, or our emotions feel like they're overriding, and we're not noticing like, oh, I have some tension here, or I'm feeling an ache here, whatever it might be. And so a lot of times it can be logistical of like, we have to set reminders to make sure that you're eating so that you don't feel sick or you don't feel exhausted by the end of the day. But then sometimes it's like, well, maybe we need to figure out maybe if there's an emotional blockage or something happening that you feel so disconnected from physical state, which can happen for a variety of reasons. Trauma is a big one, or, various different things. But yeah, that's like a thing that I see very common too. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, it's a big one.
Okay.
So what else would you like to share with us? Anything that we've kind of not hit on, we've missed?
I guess the only thing, or if people are listening, care for mental health in Michigan is not great.
No.
As we know, it's not fabulous. It's not fabulous in this country in general, but eating disorder care in Michigan particularly is really tricky. And so a lot of times people don't know where to start with that. And I think a good thing kind of just to share with parents or people, adults that are listening with an eating disorder, think I might have this kind of happening. Pediatrician or a primary care doctor is a great, place to start in terms of getting some blood work done, talking with them about kind of some of the things that could be impacted by restriction or binging for that matter. That's a good place to start, or working with a dietitian or a therapist. A lot of times I'll say to parents, we always want to give our kids the benefit of the doubt and think like, of course, like we want to keep you in the least restrictive environment as possible. So if we can keep you at home and, allow you to use your coping skills to work through this. And generally that works pretty well with a variety of illnesses, but eating disorders are one of those things that once you're kind of in it, it's really difficult to pull out of. So I always tell parents it's better to kind of overreact than underreact with this one. So there's different levels of care. Unfortunately, they're limited in Michigan, but we have some like what we call partial hospitalization programs that are 5 days a week, about 6-7 hours a day. Usually it's like group therapy, family therapy, individual therapy, and like meal support. There's that level of care, a few different places, like literally a few, probably like 3 or 4 in the state of Michigan. It's,
Oh my goodness.
It's so terrible. It's horrible. And IOP is the same thing, but 3 days a week usually. Then there's inpatient care and residential care, which in Michigan there's only one residential treatment center, and they're fairly new. So it's very interesting. But there's a lot of times you have to go out of state for eating disorder care. So I always tell people don't be threatened by that idea or intimidated. That a lot of these places are very easy to work with and are helpful. They accept insurance that's from Michigan. It's not usually a huge barrier in terms of like going across state lines. But I always just like to tell people that it does take a minute to usually get into some eating disorder treatment, and not to be too intimidated by that. But it's just unfortunately the process. But if anybody ever has any questions, you don't have to work with me necessarily, but if you ever are curious about recommendations in your area or things like that, I'm always happy to give those through email or call or whatever.
What's your website?
It's AlyssaJesseTherapy.com. It's the same thing for social media too, just at Alyssa Jesse Therapy. And we have a lot of resources that we'll post kind of on our Instagram account, our Facebook, and things like that too. But we also do workshop classes and educational presentations at schools a lot of time to parents and students about eating disorders and mental health in general.
That's amazing.
I guess that would be my last.
I didn't know that
tidbit.
I didn't know that you did stuff like that. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's I love it, which you do so much amazing work.
That's
with
really
providing
cool.
resources. It's so great because there's such limited access to these things, and so educational kind of components where we can get that in is so crucial, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it was funny because we had a guest, one of our, which one? September guests, I think. She was talking about her daughter being very suicidal, and they took her to an inpatient facility. Stephanie Newman.
Yeah, Pastor Stephanie.
Pastor Stephanie Newman. She was talking about her daughter, and they took her to Wisconsin, and she was in an inpatient facility for 6 months in Wisconsin. And then when they were ready to, kind of release her and move her back into her home in Michigan, do you remember this conversation?
I totally remember.
The nurse was like, okay, so what state do you live in? And we'll look up facilities and we'll help kind of transition her care into that place. And she said Michigan.
Yeah.
And the nurse literally said, I am so sorry.
Yeah. That's a common reaction.
Oh, yeah. It's so bad. What are we on the list of out of what?
15th. We are 35th.
Yeah,
35th out of 50. So we're 15th from the bottom in mental health.
Oh, God, I didn't know that. That's a
Yeah.
crazy statistic.
Yeah.
So totally makes sense.
Yeah, the CDC
Right?
just relisted like the states in order, and we're 35th on the list. So that feels amazing.
Yeah, and then that feels terrible too because you think about like mental health care and the quality of mental health care, which like I don't know if that's like supposed to be a good thing I'm talking about as a therapist, but like it's true, there's like quality of care, and so the places that we have are limited, and then on top of that, like sending someone there that you would trust a loved one to go, it's like so limited.
Yeah.
If they have availability and if they take your insurance and they cost an arm and a leg, and you're like
All the things.
Yep.
Yeah, fabulous.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah. So that resonated with me when you said
Totally.
that.
Yes.
So that's very scary, though, especially for eating disorders, that there's even less resources available to families and just people who need the help. So that's scary and frustrating.
I know. It is scary. With eating disorders, the main statistic that stood out to me when I was in school was that eating disorders have the highest mortality rate out of any mental illness, second to opioid overdose.
Oh my goodness,
which
for
is
real?
wild. I had no idea.
Wow,
Yeah.
I didn't either.
Yeah, I was like, that is insane, but it makes sense because the consequences of malnutrition can impact all of your organs and everything so quickly. But
Literally just shut your body down.
completely, yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So it's wild. It's unfortunate that we can't get more funding and more access to care for all mental health. But
Yeah, for sure.
Well, now you got families nowadays with the problem of just trying to get food because of the inflation.
yeah, everything's so expensive anyways. And health insurance is expensive. If you have a provider, like if you had 2 therapists that were in private practice, I don't have health insurance. I have health insurance because my husband.
Right.
But it's like, what do you do for medical care at that point?
Right.
So many system issues.
So many.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I could yap all day about it.
So could we.
Yeah.
All right. Well, do you have any other questions? Are we missing anything really major that, you want to kind of give a
I don't think
shout out to?
Oh, you guys asked incredible questions. Thank you so much.
Well, we had a lot of questions.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's for sure. Yeah.
I just feel like this is just one of those things, disordered eating and eating disorders that's not talked about very much, really at all.
Yeah.
And I think because it's such a just society, it's a norm.
Yeah.
That we just do all these things and we created a chaotic mess for ourselves. And
Oh, I could really dig into this one. I just saw this. And you don't have to answer, but
Oh, yeah.
with certain religions and the dynamic with women having to have a certain look to attract the guy. I mean, I could run off of that.
That's
for another
that's-
hour, but
Totally, yeah. And even thinking about it like religious holidays, you know, like you think about like Ramadan, there's like fasting throughout the day. And how tricky is that with a kid that, right, is practicing religion and it needs to eat structurally throughout the day? Those are such tricky
that's really hard.
situations. But
Yeah.
things like that you don't really think of that. You're like, yeah,
No.
holy smokes, yeah, there's a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah.
It just makes the situation extra hard, I feel like.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Alyssa, so
Yes,
much
thank
for
you.
being on our podcast today.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I hope that everyone takes a minute and listens to what Alyssa had to say. I think it's really, really important. So
yeah, certainly.
All right. Well, thank you, Alyssa, again. We
thank you.
appreciate
Yes,
you.
thank you.
And I guess we'll
Catch you on the flip side.
This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. We are just your friends. Whitney and I are not licensed therapists, and this podcast is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional.